I'll try to persuade you of something. It's very hard for me to accept or believe that Seattle has gotten away with this. Um, so the question you might have is gotten away with what? I'll try to persuade you of some of the details, the truthfulness of some of the details that concern me, because it strains belief. And if you come to realize that I'm right, it will strain belief in the way that I think is proper. I forget what it's called when you put a 2-point diagram on the blackboard and show the correspondence between those 2 points. So since I don't remember what it's called, I'll just do it. This point over here is Seattle's cooperation in a multi-million-dollar museum heist. And this point over here is the kidnapping, detention, forced disappearance of children into substandard detention centers that are being expanded by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And sitting in between those 2 points, of course, is a deaf poet who Seattle brutally tortured, hoping and putting me on the road to a self-destruct mechanism because I have Parkinson's. It's hard to believe that they would be celebrating ripping off a museum and putting children in detention centers and calling themselves openly Seattle left. I find that very difficult to believe. But because it's true, it needs to be explained. Some of it traces back to the Thomas Merton Center in Pittsburgh and the way that in the Jesse Jackson heyday, like 1984, people in the unions and universities were skeptical of what they called non-union labor. So with that skepticism went aversion to things like indulgence in human rights, Amnesty International, and so on. What they did make a hubbubaloo about was who was getting laid and whose girlfriend was being discouraged from continuing with their boyfriend for her own good by the usual riffraff. And Amnesty International was being funded by a man who wrote, "You better think twice before you walk out on me." A couple of women have disappeared off the face of the earth who didn't think twice in walking out on Donald Trump, who was one of the prime partners of Peter J. Sinfield and Celine Dion, when they drew a line in the sand that they called the Helter Skelter line over a letter I wrote that said, "I'm appalled that you would suggest you wanted me to make you." Read the lyrics to Helter Skelter and note that the partner who was the star of this exhibition, this atrocity exhibition that yielded millions of dollars to Seattle left through museum heist and got them giggling in glee over pedophile cannibalism while they locked up children in forced disappearance detention centers. um, was named Katz, the name of the Israeli defense minister. To note one particularly poignant recurring symbol. Now, the newspapers and the Christians play a couple of different numbers. One of them's over here going, human beings are just things, human beings are just things. The other one's going over here, people who are evil think human beings are just things. People who are evil who think human beings are just things. And then both sides make me into an object so they can complain about women's right to abortion, which I'm just hands off about. I know that they use it as a Chinese water torture. They Chinese abortion tortured me after they deafened me. No girl wanted you. We're all friends of Peter Gabriel. We're going to give you Parkinson's and sleep disturbances and set up hell as a correctional facility for just for you and some whole big thing, as they put it. Mel Brooks goes to the Navy or something. So what they have is calling me a heretic on record, basically, at Piz Gazette in a round table discussion. And the observation that you were abused, therefore we gyroscope that you must be an abuser. And this they call cyclical. And it's a necessary proclamation because the truth is perfectly obvious despite Seattle's slavish service animal to this monstrosity routine, which is that the police state observatory that was set up through the whole thing set the whole thing up. In other words, it's a self-incriminating police state hustle. And of course, they claim that John Lennon wants to make everybody a panopticon and use neuroplasm implants to create fake representation of fear of reality, which is any slander they choose to scribble between the lines. All of which is just sadistic abuse of a deaf poet who's less than a human rights warrior and even less than a non-union labor. And it's demented. It's the geopolitics of the invisible empire that includes the good kind of black. The invisible empire is now known as an arc. And one of the pun cripesers, Stephen Langer, once told his professor that what he observed about Homer was something any listener ought to see. He spelled it Odyssee, giggle, giggle, which is like WANSI, the WANSI conference. And Seattle says, no. Here's how they say that, like, no, yo, Y-O. No, yo. You're making a whole big thing. That doesn't implicate Stephen Langer in torturing you. He said, I'm not sorry for anything I did, only did it have to be you. No, yo. That doesn't mean you could have saved John Lennon, that you ought to see the WANSI implications in Gail Burstyn's script. And Seattle gets away with this. Plain and simple. and they bomb Gaza, and they perpetuate this self-incriminating police state hustle for as long as they can keep it gyrating. And now they've come up with, I hate to add to the stuff going on. We know that it's horrifying, and that the most horrifying thing of all is that there's not a revolution about it. People are just sitting on their hands and going, duh, duh. And when you ask them what that means, they say, duh. But the magnitude of the price paid to have their cherished souls recognized in Palestine is an eternal crime. And if I have to graffiti this talk with the horrible names concerned, it's a lesser price to pay, certainly. So I will vomit bag name Epstein Island. It's a pretty good indication of the truth, underwriting all the moral posturing of Pope Karl in the parochial establishment. Pitt, the University of Pittsburgh, authored the Federal Emergency Management Agency Constitution, and they also wreaked havoc from Mount Desert Island in the 80s. Nevertheless, they are a learning institution and establishment, administrative headquarters. Therefore, they bear a special responsibility to bring about Federal Emergency Management Agency schools to intercept and stop this nonsense leading to detention genocide. But of course, Seattle stands in the way. If you ask them to help reform FEMA on behalf of the University of Pittsburgh's public schools philosophers who had no say in creating FEMA, who drove school buses in the retirement, they will say no, and help museum thieves drive recklessly around school buses. And it's dizzyingly absurd theater, but a moral monstrosity as well. Seattle has a license to do nothing but loll their tongues and admit to being imbeciles.